Hi, welcome back to part two. I'm Stephen Drunsic with Q&A Live. This is part two of my interview with Dr. Arjun Makhijani. Arjun, thank you for being back with us.
Well, thanks so much for asking me.
You know, we talked about a number of issues, this very broad subject of energy, and I'd like to return to the genesis of nuclear power, nuclear energy in this country. You had made a salient point about the nuclear power industry kind of being the fig leaf in response to our nuclear weapons program back in the 50s.
Right.
Maybe you want to expand on that.
Yeah. So it was basically, you know, it was to say something positive about nuclear technology. President Eisenhower introduced this Atoms for Peace program, and the substance of it was that they would offer this if countries decided not to have nuclear weapons. That was the origin of the Non-Proliferation Treaty from the late 1960s, but it started in '53. And that started the ball rolling in this country for civilian nuclear energy in a big way. Of course, there's already nuclear energy in the military field and also in the field of nuclear reactors and power for ships, military ships. The other countries also had power programs, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, and so on. And they actually used their weapons reactors for power production from the beginning, actually, unlike this country. So, of course, there was the question of the uranium, the raw materials, the waste, the economics. All of these questions began to be addressed. Safety, what about accidents? So it was known from the beginning that there could be catastrophic accidents. So what to do in case of catastrophic accidents? What could be the scale of the damage? So all these questions were actually explicitly put on the table in the 1950s in this country.
They were put on the table, but were they effectively resolved? And
of course,
from my impression, obviously, some of the articles that you've written about focus on the fact that the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has never really effectively addressed some of these issues in terms of disposal, in terms of harmful radiation, and of course now we're talking about this under the guise of, you know, having Fukushima, which just occurred a couple of years ago, which I'm sure is very present in a lot of people's minds. So.
Right. So it was recognized in the 1950s. So here's some fundamentals about nuclear reactors. So you put uranium fuel inside the reactor. There are two parts to that fuel. One is the part that fissions and does the chain reaction and you get the energy. The other part doesn't sustain a chain reaction, and that's most of it. That's uranium-238. But it absorbs a neutron and becomes plutonium, which does sustain a chain reaction. So now, at the time, it was thought that this type of reactor that we have, like Vermont Yankee or Indian Point in New York, is only a temporary kind of thing. We'll ultimately have reactors where we'll turn all of that non-fissile uranium-238, which is not a fuel, into plutonium, which is a fuel, and we have this magical energy source. We'll be making more energy than we consume. So Alvin Weinberg, who was the scientific director of Oak Ridge National Lab, said in the 1970s that we'll make this magical energy source, but society has to do a Faustian bargain with us. That was his phrase, that they have to trust us as they have, this is a paraphrase obviously, as they have with nuclear weapons, that we will deal with the problems of waste essentially as a nuclear priesthood. So nuclear energy is, first of all, a very anti-democratic source. You make this Faustian bargain, you give away your democracy, you give away, you know, and you give it to this priesthood, which is scientific nuclear priesthood, to take care of this. Later on, Alvin Weinberg actually regretted that they didn't pay much attention to the problem of waste. He wrote about that in his memoir. In the 50s, they thought most of this is actually usable material, and a small part of it, about 3-4%, of the used fuel is waste, and we will mix that with molten glass, and we'll put the molten glass in a salt mine, and the salt will fuse around it, and it'll be good. Now, the problem is that it was a bunch of physicists who were thinking about it. And the physics of it looked very simple.
Versus the engineers.
Versus the engineers and versus the geologists. Now, when you get into geology and characterizing something that's a couple of thousand feet deep and figuring out how stable it is and what will happen to it in 100,000 years, this is no longer a physics problem. This is a much, much more complicated geologic, engineering, mining, rock mechanics. So nobody was, one of the pioneers of the nuclear industry actually said later on that nobody got any brownie points for dealing with waste. So that was the framework. Everybody was gung-ho about designing their favorite reactor. Every reactor and almost every bomb concept that we have today was done in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s. Nothing that I know of in terms of concept is new today that wasn't proposed back then. Very creative folks, but they weren't thinking about waste. That was the days of the Atomic Energy Commission. In the late 60s, some safety issues came to the fore with the kind of reactors that we have. The very same safety issues that we're looking at in Fukushima. The exact same. What happens if there's a power failure? What happens if there's a loss of coolant? What happens if there's a loss of coolant and a power failure and there's hydrogen? So there were kind of an attempt to suppress the experiments and the results. There were big scandals. That's how the Atomic Energy Commission got split up into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and later on what became the Department of Energy. And we were supposed to have an independent regulatory watchdog. But of course, it didn't make the physical problems go away. All the reactors that we have that generate electricity here and in Japan and most of the world are vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic failure that we are looking at in Fukushima.
Well, okay.
And that's an accident going on for years.
And that's a very good, interesting point, because a lot of proponents will say, well, Fukushima sat on a massive fault. It was built too close to the ocean. If you look at a number of reactors here in the country, most would say they're not near a fault line. They're not near a major source of, a body of water where they could, be vulnerable to a tsunami, for instance, like Vermont Yankee here. What is your response to that?
Well, Vermont Yankee is downstream from a very big dam, right? So you could have, we may not be vulnerable to tsunamis, obviously, at Vermont Yankee. And I think the vast majority of nuclear power plants in the United States are not similarly vulnerable to tsunamis as some of the Japanese plants. But it's not the tsunami, this particular mechanism or that particular mechanism. The basic idea is you can have a station blackout for a number of different reasons, and we have had them in this country. So when the total power goes out and your diesel generators fail, as they did, so in that case they failed because of tsunami in their particular
So any
location.
failure of the coolant pumps, any failure of that system.
So for instance, we have the Fort Calhoun plant in Nebraska, which has been sitting in the middle of a flood from the Mississippi River, shut down for years together now, right? At one time it looked like somebody built a nuclear island over there, all surrounded by water. So we've got a nuclear power plant in Minnesota which is sitting in an island in the middle of the Mississippi River. The specific modes of arriving at an accident are different. The probabilities are different, and they partly depend on the reactor and partly on the regulatory system. So what did we say after Chernobyl? Chernobyl was a catastrophic accident. What was said was, it can't happen here because the Soviets don't have a regulatory system, they're not transparent, they're not democratic, and the Chernobyl design was very vulnerable. And all of those things have a fair amount of merit. We had one reactor of the Chernobyl design in Washington State, which was shut down a year after Chernobyl, which was all to the good. but Western regulatory systems are much better. Well, after Fukushima, now we're hearing, well, it can't happen here because the Japanese regulatory system is too cozy with the industry. And we have to look at our Nuclear Regulatory Commission and say, well, how cozy are they with the industry? And you look at what has happened as a result of Fukushima. So the current chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission voted to have the maximum safety measured in regard to the vents and filters that didn't work as they should have at Fukushima to be backfitted. But only part of that was required by the order because 4 other commissioners did not vote that way. And I think part of the deal is reluctance, in my opinion, now this is a surmise and not a fact from a document, is a real reluctance to impose serious costs on industry because it may make them uncompetitive. It's not different in principle than the China jobs issue. I think if people want to go into any community, we're all human beings, we must have the same strict safety, environmental, labor, living standards. And then I think we'll all be better off. There may be some people at the top who won't be able to afford their 3rd chateau someplace.
That's very utopian of you.
We won't all be better off. You know, as I said, some people won't be able to afford their 3rd chateau. But, you know, today we have a situation where a few hundred people have more wealth than, I think, the poorest 3 billion people in the world. That's very unhealthy for everybody, including the children of those people, I would say.
And of course, and I think the whole discussion on income inequality is a very colorful discussion and one that will excite a lot of various individuals across the political spectrum. And obviously, I think that does play a part in our discussion here on energy policy and the costs and benefits of nuclear energy. And but I do want to get back to so much of your past experience has been focused on how to better address proper disposal
of nuclear waste,
as well as the consequences of radiation and harmful effects on humans in the event of some effect like Chernobyl or Fukushima.
So here's my take on nuclear power, and then you'll get my take on nuclear waste as a result of that big picture. So power plant, nuclear reactor is just a boiler. It's just like a coal boiler, but with a fire on the inside. And of course, you can't turn off the fire because that fuel is hot. So it's a little more complicated machine that's more difficult to manage, and that's radioactive afterwards. Now, what we're doing is we're making plutonium and these highly radioactive products that last, some of which last for seconds and some of which last for millions of years, just to boil water. Now, that because the radioactive waste gives off, radioactive decay gives off heat, the danger doesn't stop when you shut off the reactor. That's why we have to cool these spent fuel pools. Every 1,000 megawatt reactor, a little bit bigger than Vermont Yankee, makes about 30 bombs worth of plutonium every year.
Goodness.
So 30 bombs. You have to separate.
And that plutonium is the byproduct that's now sitting in these cooling pools.
It is sitting in the spent fuel. So spent fuel, like here in Vermont Yankee, every ton of spent fuel has 10 kilograms, 20 pounds of plutonium in it. It takes about that much to make a bomb with that plutonium. You have to separate it first from everything else that's in that spent fuel, from the other 99%.
It's a bit of a process.
Yeah. But today, there is enough commercial separated plutonium in the civilian sector in the world today as all the military plutonium and all the nuclear weapon states put together. A lot of it is in France and Britain and Japan and Russia and India and the United States.
Let me just put this in perspective for everyone here. The spent fuel rods, for instance, let's use Vermont Yankee right now.
Right.
They are holding on to 620 metric tons of nuclear waste, which is essentially plutonium.
Well, 1% is plutonium.
1%, okay. That's sitting in cooling pools.
Right.
and they're still generating heat.
Yes.
And so
much less now than before.
You're cycling water through these pools to tamp down the heat process. What are we talking about? In other words, if there was to be a loss of water in these pools, which I guess is what happened in part of Fukushima, as part of their issue too, is they lost water, what are we talking about?
See, if you lose cooling, so long as the reactor is running, every so often it has to be refueled. So you have to take out this very, very highly radioactive used fuel and put it in a pool. Now, the heat in it decays pretty rapidly, but it stays hot enough and generates enough heat that you have to cool it for a few years before you can take it out of the water. If you don't cool it, and this is a big fear still at Fukushima, if you lose that coolant, it's just like losing coolant in a reactor. That water could boil, you could get hydrogen generation, you could get explosions, and you could get fires. If the pool drains suddenly, if it is as packed as Vermont Yankee is, which is a very packed pool, you could get fires and you could get catastrophic.
Because of the reaction with the air, and
that's right,
which creates hydrogen, which has a minute.
One of the design issues that's fundamental with this type of reactor is the fuel tubes are made out of a zirconium alloy called zircalloy, and that reacts with steam to create hydrogen. And so that's where the hydrogen and the hydrogen explosions at Fukushima came from. There was actually a hydrogen explosion fire even at 3 Mile Island, but it was contained by the secondary containment, which was much stronger than the building in Fukushima, which obviously, buildings in Fukushima, which gave way.
So and we'll go back to Fukushima, because that's a very important topic. But let's continue this discussion on disposal of these spent fuel rods.
So what to do with the waste? So initially they thought they would do reprocessing, what they do in France. We'll take out the plutonium, we'll reuse the uranium, and we'll put the fission products, these radioactive materials, most of the radioactivity in glass, and we'll bury the glass logs. Well, that turned out to be more complicated on many fronts. First of all, taking out the plutonium and using it as fuel turned out to be very expensive. So the French, for instance, who do it, spend a lot of money. I think they spend about $1 billion extra every year to get that plutonium. They shouldn't be doing it on economic grounds. Then you have all this separated plutonium, and after the Indian nuclear test in '74, actually, President Ford thought that maybe it's not such a good idea to have large stocks of civilian plutonium because it could result in the spread of bombs. So that became a huge issue. So he put that policy into place that the U.S. should move away from that. President Carter firmed it up. And even though President Reagan lifted the prohibition, it's still the de facto policy here. So that's the second issue. So that original solution for then the third was the type of reactor that was going to turn all this uranium into useful fuel, the breeder reactor, which is sodium cooled. That type of reactor turned out to be technically difficult.
Are you talking about thorium reactor?
No, not thorium reactors. Thorium reactor, different type of breeder. But this is a sodium cooled reactor that would use uranium. Thorium reactors have similar type of problems.
It uses thorium as
thorium is not a fuel, actually. Thorium is a breeding material to make uranium-233. Little bit different issue. The sodium, we've spent worldwide $100 billion with a B, $100 billion trying to commercialize the sodium-cooled breeder reactor that would supposedly reduce this waste problem and deal with the plutonium. Failed. The last two reactors, Superphénix in France and Monju in Japan, worked worse than many of the earlier ones. There's been no demonstrable learning curve, more expensive than regular reactors, which are already plenty expensive. So that kind of solution fell apart. So now we're stuck with all the spent fuel in these pools and nowhere to go. Originally, it had somewhere to go.
Yucca Mountain, are you referring to?
No, not the Yucca Mountain came later. Originally, we were going to deal with it, take out the plutonium, use the uranium, have lots of breeder reactors, and use up all the plutonium and uranium. And that's 96% of the waste. That fell apart in the 70s for proliferation reasons, cost reasons, technical reasons. So now we had nothing to do with the spent fuel. Some people think we should still do the same thing, but it's a non-starter.
Costly prohibitive.
Yeah, cost prohibitive, proliferation prohibitive, prohibitive in every sensible way you can think of. So now we're stuck with the spent fuel that has nowhere to go. My approach to this is we shouldn't be making plutonium just to boil water. One of the main problems with this stuff in the long term, plutonium half-life 24,000 years, is that you can make bombs with it. So if you know that you're down a road that's not doing any good, you should see an end to it. So I'm very glad what you have done in Vermont, that through some compromise and some muscular process, some regulatory process, some sensible process, you've arrived at a decision that you're going to do without nuclear energy. And the question is, are you going to make more pollution to replace it, or are we going to do it in a way that's clean? So I think you're doing it in a way that's clean. You've got a very good.
How much time do we have today?
Yeah. So that's the first thing. If you've dug yourself into a deep hole, as they say, the first thing to do is to stop digging. So we have to find a reasonable way, not suddenly like Japan, which is a very chaotic way to do it. You import gas, you import coal, CO2 emissions going up. That's a chaotic way to do it. I'm not advocating that Japan should restart its reactors. I think they're better off now looking forward.
Sorry.
But we should find an orderly way to do it, and I think Vermont has set us a good example. So that's number one. Number two is we ought to store it much more safely. Having these densely packed pools is not a good idea. So some of the people who invited me, Deb Katz from CAN, and she had a conference after 9/11, and I proposed that we ought to have something called HOS, hardened on-site storage. So dry storage, which is generally safer than wet storage. Now you can't put all the fuel in dry storage because you have to cool the hot fuel for some years. But here, most of the fuel is old fuel. It's been stored there for decades. And that fuel can be moved to dry storage. So I really admire the agreement that you all have come up with the utility, that fuel is going to be moved to dry storage in 7 years. It'll keep people employed. It'll reduce the risk. And in 7 years, you'll be done with the worst. You won't be done with all the risks, but you'll be done with the worst risks.
This is part of the decommissioning process.
This is part of the decommissioning process. So I think Vermont has shown us for the short and medium term is a good way. Now the long-term plan was supposed to be Yucca Mountain. Now here, actually, a part company with many environmentalists is, I am with them in saying we should stop digging this hole. We should see an end to this stream of waste.
But we need to find a hole.
But we need to find another hole. And it's not that a repository is a good solution. It's the least bad solution. Mm-hmm. I don't have a crystal ball that says what's going to happen to it in 100,000 years. And I've looked enough at this question, more than 30 years. And for 10 years, I struggled with this idea, should I be saying these things in public? Is there an alternative? And came to the conclusion that all possible alternatives are much worse than a repository, which is not a very good solution, but every alternative is much worse.
It's like burying our garbage. Ultimately we have to find some solution that's going to involve putting it in the ground.
Yeah, so we generate less of it. That's the starting point. Right. We recycle as much as we can. Of course, in this case, you can't recycle the plutonium because once you separate it, you got bomb material, and you don't want to do that. So it's different than your regular garbage. So Yucca Mountain and the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was actually agreed to by many people. I wasn't involved in that debate, but I have said and published that we need a sound repository program. So we need a process for determining. See, a repository program isn't finding a place to dump it. So that's the first thing. A repository program consists of 3 different technical pieces. It's the place, it's the rock, it is what you put the waste in, the barriers, and you can find many good geologies. You can find many places in the earth where there are natural radioactive materials, and they haven't gone anywhere for millions of years. So we know that there are geologic situations where containment is pretty perfect. However, to make a repository, you got to dig a very, very big, deep hole, so now you no longer have an intact geologic location. Then you're putting very hot wastes in it, so you're changing the whole temperature. Now you've got all the original water, which could be reducing water, is gone. So in Sweden, they had reducing water, copper canisters, excellent. Then you got to fill it back up. Now you got all these joints, right? And are you going to be leaking rainwater into the joints? Is the water chemistry going to change? How long is it going to take to reestablish the original water chemistry? What's going to happen now that the water is going to be a lot hotter because you got this waste?
How much hotter?
Well, more than the boiling point of water.
That's how hot these canisters remain.
Yes, so for some time. So now you've got boiling and condensing going on.
Sure, and expansion and contraction.
Right.
And
so the question is, are you going to crack the rock? So Yucca Mountain was an unsaturated repository. So it didn't have, it wasn't below the water table. That was considered good. However, it's a porous rock with oxygen, and there's moisture in the pores. Now you've got heat, oxygen, moisture, and metal canisters, which is a recipe for rust. So it turned out, in my opinion, Yucca Mountain was the worst site that was investigated in this country. 20 miles from an aquifer in a place where there's no other, above an aquifer where 20 miles it is being used to grow crops today. While it was shown as a remote location, the people actually growing food that we all eat.
People that live around there.
Your pomegranate juice, some of those pomegranates might come from just 20 miles from Yucca Mountain.
It's a big case of NIMBY.
So we need to have a process of thinking through a geologic isolation program. And when the Blue Ribbon Commission on Nuclear Waste asked me to testify, I said, don't rush into site selection. Study this triple problem for 10 years. Do a lot of scientific research on what combinations of geology, engineered barriers, and sealing systems will actually work together.
And who's doing this?
No one is doing it.
Okay.
I'm just advocating it for forever. No one is doing it. Everybody wants to rush to a site, consent-based. Somebody somewhere with high unemployment will say, give it to me.
Well, Areva, this company called Areva in West Texas apparently is taking waste from Vermont Yankee.
Well, that
I think they just agreed to a
low-level
deal.
waste,
That's
yes.
low-level waste, okay.
Yeah, that's so reactors. So the nuclear system generates all different kinds of waste.
Okay.
More than 99%, I think, of the radioactivity is in the spent fuel, which is sitting in your pools. But there's also a lot of other radioactivity. So the fuel rods have, hairline defects from which radioactivity gets into the water, and then the water is cleaned up by filters. And then those filters, of course, become radioactive. And that's some of the waste that is going from Vermont Yankee to Texas. And of course, Texas and Vermont have a compact where Vermont can send its waste to Texas.
And I guess, I'm kind of, talking to someone like you, I've never been against nuclear. I thought it was a way to deliver carbon-free, cheap energy. But obviously, talking through this whole waste issue, and of course what's happened recently in Japan, certainly makes me think again about the concept of nuclear energy, and it really just sounds like it's a Pandora's box, and it's really difficult to close that box. And we don't really have a solution, a final solution for how to deal with the, 70,000 metric tons of nuclear waste we have in this country.
Yeah, and counting. No, there are too many problems that stretch out for too far into the future. So, as I said in our last segment, that there's no energy source without environmental impact. So we should all learn to switch off the lights when we don't need them, because all of them have environmental impact. But some energy sources, you can reverse your actions if you don't like it. You minimize the impact, wind, solar, you put it on your rooftop. You try to make your solar panels out of materials that are recyclable and plentiful. Not the case with all solar panels, but silicon fortunately happens to be very plentiful. You want to make your silicon.
But not exactly cheap.
Silicon is not cheap because
getting cheaper.
It's costly to make silicon out of
Right.
sand, but the raw material is plentifully available. But you want to make it in a way that is clean. So that's not always done. So there's environmental impact from making solar panels. I think, so there's a question of view, for instance. Aesthetics are very important. But I say we should at least look at the source of our electricity rather than having it hidden in some spent fuel pool and kicking the plutonium down the road to our kids. If our kids don't like the view and find some better way of making electricity, they will be able to do that. They'll be able to take that tower down and recycle the materials and do something with them.
Well, what about all the smokestacks and the coal-burning plants in this country?
That's right.
I mean, surely we don't like that view, but yet it seems like ultimately we detach ourselves because we're so accustomed to turning on the light switch and
Yes.
getting in our cars and not really thinking about.
Right. So, Steve, we are with the energy system today where we were with the food system 20 years ago, before fast food nation and before omnivore's dilemma and before the organic farmers movement and before the locavore movement. Mm-hmm. We all believed, those who lived in urban areas and worked in offices, that food grows in grocery stores. You go to the grocery store, one piece of meat is as good as any other piece of meat. One nice looking apple is as good as another nice looking apple. But today we think differently about food. We know that it matters whether cattle are fed antibiotics or not, that it affects our health. It affects the quality of the food. I know from my own life, when I changed my diet, I was, for some neurological reason, some considerable pain, and I changed my diet, and I was 75% better in a week. It was almost like a miracle. It was a fabulous diet miracle, coupled with a little exercise. Now, we need to be in the same place with energy. Our energy system is very unhealthy for us.
And we need to feel that. We need to feel that. And of course, I think the answer to that is what's happening with these dramatic climactic events.
I think climate is remote for a lot of people and it's not remote for others. So when we have weather like this and we realize that it's climate disruption, it becomes more real. But some things are very immediate. The asthma, the respiratory diseases, the mountaintop removal, the plutonium in your neighborhood sitting in a spent fuel pool that might catch fire. So some risks are very immediate and they should wake us up. Now, if we didn't have an alternative, but today we are very fortunate not to have the same limited set as the French had in 1973. Today, as I told you, I came very slowly and reluctantly to not reluctantly, but reluctantly in the sense of I didn't want to advocate something where the public would feel that Arjun Makhijani advocated some kind of ideologically oriented. No, I wanted to put forward something that was technically thorough. And I have debated the nuclear industry on this. I always have an open door to the nuclear industry to debate anytime and on any forum, and I have done it more than once. And I said, what are the objections to this? You tell me. And that is my normal mode of, so thorium reactors, I had a debate on Science Friday, the transcript is available.
I've got a good friend who brought up the concept of thorium reactors and how they're a potentially better alternative, although there is fissile material involved.
So did you tell them to go to listen to my Science Friday debate, which you can see the transcript?
I'll make that recommendation.
Yeah. So I think we should remain open to the flaws in our own argument, and I just wish that everybody who was involved in the energy system is as open to that. And obviously, we need to improve even renewable energy sources. We need to find better to reduce the amount of silicon we use in solar panels, for instance. And
there's patents out for that.
And over the last 10 years, the amount of silicon needed for solar panels has increased greatly. And if we increase their efficiency, it'll go down even more. And ultimately, I'm confident. So I'm not a technological optimist in some kind of Panglossian sense, where everything is kind of with rose-colored glasses. But technology has a very important role to play. But the main issue will be how we look at the problem. Are we going to look behind the
Or
plug?
if we can see the problem in the first place.
We need to look behind the plug. There's as much behind the plug as there is behind the grocery store counter. And it's bad for our health to not do it.
I want to, well, segue. This is all part of the same conversation, but some interesting facts in your book that I picked up on. I think there are 6 states in the United States, North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, a couple of the other western states. Their total wind capacity would generate the same amount of electricity as all of the nuclear power plants in the country.
More.
In each
more,
state alone.
Each state alone, yes.
Which I guess just goes to tell you that there's a massive amount of solar and wind capture opportunity out there. So let me ask you this, and this is somewhat of a rhetorical question, but how come we're not harnessing wind? How come we're not harnessing solar more than we already are? Where do you feel that?
You know,
and we already are, obviously.
You know which is the largest amount of wind energy in the United States? Which state?
Texas?
Texas,
yes.
So hardly your bastion of liberals.
Sure.
You know. But they know that there's money in it. They're, you know, in the oil and gas tradition, there's money in wind, they're doing it. New England, which you wouldn't regard as a paradise of renewable energy.
Very difficult.
The amount of solar potential and offshore wind potential, so leaving aside all the ridges, is dozens of times more than the electricity and energy requirements of New England. And yet, so you don't have to go all the way to North Dakota to bring your electricity.
But I want to make a point about New England. This is interesting because here in Vermont, in fact, I think it's up in Stratford or somewhere up north or St. Johnsbury, there's a wind farm, Lowell Farm, and I think there's actually a lawsuit against this wind development. You know, you do run up to, against this issue of not in my backyard, and that seems to be especially apparent here in Vermont because we protect our ridge lines and everything, but it just goes to show that, you know, there's a little bit of hypocritical nature to the arguments of wanting to be pro-renewable, anti-carbon, anti-nuclear, but then when we have a potential alternative that solves those problems, that reconciles those issues, we just don't want to do it here.
Well, the people who are
not to say they don't have an argument,
are not. The people who are against wind development are not often not those who are against fossil fuels, and often they'll be saying that we don't need to worry about climate change. Not all, but some. Some may just think that all energy sources are bad. So then they have the obligation of saying exactly should we be. So here are the alternatives: freeze in the dark, use fossil fuels, pollute the air, create climate change, kick plutonium down the road to your kids, or look at the view. You know?
Exactly.
I mean,
it's ultimately going to be boiled down to the least of all evils, which ultimately...
Which is why learning to turn off the lights is very important.
Yes.
And efficiency is very important. So you got free energy in the earth, tap it, get some reasonable public policy, or let's do like Hanover House. Why do not we require every house to have the efficiency of Hanover House? It's right here in our neighborhood where we've eliminated where we are right now, where 85% of the energy, and he's got refrigerators. You know, it's not like Hanover House doesn't have the modern conveniences. It's a well-built house with many fancy features, and it was not very costly.
Okay. We should have booked 3 hours here. With the time remaining, I want to return to this important topic of Fukushima. And the reason is because there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of concern out there about the long-term, the immediate, and the near-term effects of leaking radiation, cesium-137, 134 iodine, 131. Your knowledge, let's apply it here. Can you tell us what our worries should be? Should the West Coast be worrying about contaminated seafood in the next 6 months? Should they, you know, what are we looking at?
Okay, let's put Fukushima in some perspective. So first of all, I'll tell you what not to worry about from Fukushima.
Great.
You don't have to worry about iodine 131. It's all gone. The reactors are all shut. Short half-life, 8 days, it's done. It's finished. There's no more of it. Whatever damage it was going to do, mostly it did around Japan, and there are children who are affected, and they have been affected, and they have to be monitored. We have to take care of them. The cesium-137, strontium-90, you know, they're the spent fuel pooled with all that plutonium and so on in them. So there are 4 problems at Fukushima that we need to worry about. One is all that molten fuel at the bottom of 3 reactors. There was a meltdown. And it appears that at least 1 or more of the reactor buildings is compromised from the bottom. So groundwater seems to be contacting this molten fuel and is leaching out strontium-90, which is biologically much worse than cesium-137, because cesium-137 goes all over the body and its effect is a little dispersed, and it goes to the muscle. Strontium-90 goes to the bone, where we have our bone marrow, we have the stem cells of our immune system, we have, you know, strontium-90 is bad stuff.
Bad stuff.
Just as an example, the limit in drinking water for strontium-90 for a comparable cancer effect for an adult is 100, and the limit for strontium is 8. So that gives you some rough idea. I also think strontium-90 is much more dangerous for pregnant women because it can affect the developing baby much more, you know, like when the bones are formed and so on.
So this is something we should be worrying about.
Yeah.
It's
so the fact
into
that strontium-90 is leaching into the groundwater
and leaching into the ocean by
and
extension.
now some of that groundwater is flowing into the ocean. So far as the local measurements go, which, you know, I think there's ample reason to not trust TEPCO and the government of Japan, where it's still an unhappy institutional situation. That's one thing to worry about. Then because there's more contaminated water now and it rains into these buildings, so they have to cool this molten fuel. So there's a lot of contaminated water being generated. About almost half of that is being filtered, just like the water is filtered here in the reactors. But half of that is not being filtered. So they've got these 1,000 tanks with contaminated water that were
exposed to the air?
That were hastily built,
okay.
Many of which are leaking. And when they have leaked, the radiation levels around the tanks have been up to lethal levels. So there's obviously a lot of radioactivity in these tanks. If there's another earthquake, you can have a massive amount of leakage of water. Fortunately, they are still holding up. And the third is the spent fuel pools. So the spent fuel pools have a lot more strontium-90 and cesium-137. And so if there's a fire or an accident, then you have strontium going to the ground, cesium going into the air, and we could have a lot more problems. As far as the ocean and the fish and the contamination of the ocean is concerned, I think the radiation problems are mainly in Japan. They are with the workers, they are with the life around, both on land and in the sea around Fukushima. So much of the sort of animal life around Fukushima has been affected, including in the abandoned places. Now we've got radioactive pigs that were, you know, and so on. Now, so far as the United States is concerned, so fish swim across the ocean.
You've got a radiated food chain on the
you've got
coast.
an irradiated food chain. So fishing is banned off of Fukushima, but fish do swim. So,
right.
And they can swim across the ocean. So I would say the first thing that needs to be done that isn't being done, and I think the government is not being very responsible, is that EPA and Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration should be making dense and frequent measurements of the ocean water and fish on the West Coast and making that
And they're not doing this now?
And they're not doing it. They're not doing Fukushima-related measements on the West Coast.
Surprises me.
In 2011, the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute here in Massachusetts did a Fukushima expedition, and they found contaminated fish hundreds of miles at levels of contamination that were not
hundreds of miles from where?
From Fukushima.
Okay.
That were not explicable by original fallout from the accident in March 2011.
Meaning it's continuous.
Meaning there seemed to be some continuous source, but undetermined and unclear. It required the investment of substantial resources by governments like Japan, United States, China. The concerned countries should have been doing this, but they're all building nuclear power plants, or all want to build nuclear power plants. So the Woods Hole people themselves have been saying that we should be, that it doesn't appear that the West Coast, because of dilution, I mean, a tuna swimming across the ocean and getting cesium in Fukushima would have eliminated much of that by its biological processes by the time it reaches the West Coast. The cesium will still be there, but won't be in the tuna's body. But we don't know because we're not making the measurements.
Because a lot of it's eliminated?
Yeah, cesium is like potassium. So potassium is cycling
in the body. It just goes through the body.
It
doesn't stay in the flesh or...
No, it stays in the flesh for a certain amount of time, so we need potassium constantly because we're eliminating potassium. Right. It's part of our bodies and it cycles through. It's like water, at different rates. Some stays in, though, and some could become part of your muscles and your,
right.
your organic system. So how much? We don't know. We know that the Pacific Ocean is huge and there's lots of dilution. How much? We don't know.
Right.
To solve this question is not complicated. To solve this question requires some dedicated resources by the federal government, and they should be doing it along the West Coast.
And
no question, including Alaska.
Meaning repetitive testing at certain points throughout the...
Periodic, frequent testing.
That's not going to solve the problem. That's just going to monitor the...
It's going to tell you whether you have a problem or not. In my opinion, the level of concern today is much higher than what is likely to be found if we measure. But can I assure you that the concern should be lower? I cannot. Because, it's like when you're waiting for a bus. The worst part is if there's no timetable and you don't know when it's going to come.
Right.
The uncertainty is always the most stressful and difficult
Absolutely.
thing. So in the absence of measurements, I would say if you're a young woman thinking of becoming pregnant, I think you should better know where your fish is coming from. You want to be sure, right? Do I, as an older man, worry about it? I personally don't, because I have less to worry. I'm not going to become pregnant, right? So but most of that caution comes from uncertainty. I think personally that the level of concern on the West Coast is above what I would have, but I can do a lot more math than most people, and I'm in the radiation business and I know it. I do understand the level of concern that people have, and I think most of it is because of the absence of information, and equally important...
Or misinformation.
Equally important that the authorities who are responsible for giving the information to the public, especially in Japan, and to some extent also here, are not trusted by the public. And to some extent, I would say that this loss of trust is justified, because the first line in the press release after something goes wrong is, "Don't worry." Whereas I told the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission when I met her a little over a year ago, that the first line should be, "We're looking into it, and we need to be cautious, and we'll let you know."
Yeah, and this, of course, has happened in West Virginia recently as well.
Right. So that press release needs to be changed. And so long as that... The Nuclear Regulatory Commission says that 620 millirem of radiation, averagely over 300 million people in the United States, including medical radiation, has not been shown to cause harm. This is not properly founded statement. 620 millirem average over 300 million people would be associated with more than 200,000 cancers. And I have said this in writing to the chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And did they actually deal with it and change their web page? No, they said, we have a reference for this and we're fine with it.
So let me ask you this. What is this doing to the West Coast fisheries? In other words, if I'm a tuna fisherman or any fisherman, or I'm up in Alaska, I mean, have they taken steps? You would think that the U.S. government or the states would be taking steps to protect the fishing stock, the fisheries, and the vital industries that exist along the West Coast. And you're saying none of that's
I don't know whether
the
state governments are doing it. I mostly am focused on my work in the United States, and in the last year and a half, almost all my work is focused in the state where I live for the first time, actually, Maryland. So I actually, the room I have to follow Fukushima, which I do because people ask me about it, you know, fairly frequently. I try to follow it as well as I can, but I can't tell you honestly that I'm on top of all of the aspects of the Fukushima problem, because I'm not.
Okay. Well, obviously, I think you did give us a little bit of information.
But ended on a humble note.
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, we certainly appreciate your humility. But, you know, on that note, I think it's been a very fascinating discussion.
Yeah,
you seem to bring a lot of clarity to a lot of subject matter that I think sometimes often gets a little bit too politicized. You know, we have to respect all sorts of viewpoints on this, and obviously the concept of where we get our energy from is going to challenge our country and the rest of the world for decades and millennia to come. But let's just hope that at least we're cognizant of what we're doing to our environment, and hopefully making the right choices. So, thanks for coming on, Doctor.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
And thank you for spending another hour with me. Again, I'm Stephen Drunsic. This has been another hour of Q&A Live, and we'll see you next time.